Hello. What you need? What you need? Can you sit? Please? No? Okay, you're almost there. Thank you. Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of August. I'll go pretty much in order of when I read them. I'm going to talk about the books that I finished first, and then I'll talk about the books that I worked on or started. So to begin, I had a few reads for the Read-eh-thon, which was a read-a-thon that centers Canadian authors. I didn't make a TBR for this, but I decided to join in after hearing some about it. And the first thing that I read for that was The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline. This is an Indigenous dystopian novel. I really enjoyed it. It's been a while since I've read a dystopian, unless you include The Seep, but I don't read a whole lot of dystopians, especially ones that are YA. I think this kind of is on the brink between, like, I think that adult readers could potentially like it, but I think this is technically considered YA. It's been a while since I've read any dystopian YA, and I think that this broke a lot of the conventions that I was expecting from a dystopian book. From what I have read and I have seen, it seems like a lot of more recent dystopians are very much modeled after the Hunger Games, and that sort of thing, but this was absolutely not the case. I don't want to give too much away, but a lot of the times with YA dystopian, there's the chosen one, and naturally they're the main character, but this one didn't really follow that so much. So that was nice. I thought in general that the setting and the condition of the dystopia was really impactful. It talks about genocide, and it also talks about the environment a whole lot. The storytelling I also really liked. Some of the chapters, rather than just being a continuation of the story that's going on, they present different characters' stories. It's them telling their own story, kind of in the oral traditions that a lot of Indigenous people have. So I thought that was really great. I was kind of disappointed with the very forced romance that was in this. Honestly, there was a character that I wished that the book had been focused on, that I think that I would have enjoyed the book better if it was from their perspective. But overall, this was a really great book. I gave it 4 stars. The next book that I got to for the Read-eh-thon was Not Your Princess, Voices of a Native American Women, edited by Lisa Charleyboy and Mary Beth Leatherdale. And this is an anthology of poetry and art by Indigenous women. Let's see if we can give some examples. So here, you can see there's a poem by one person, art by another. A lot of the times they complement each other. There's also photography, and I think there are maybe 1 or 2 pictures that are just photographs of, like, I think there are some athletes that they talk about who are Native American, but some of the photography is also by Indigenous photographers, like with this one. They're sharing this person's writing, and a Native person also took a picture. This was a really good reading experience. It was pretty small, but there was definitely a whole lot packed in here. They kind of separated some of them out by themes, which I thought was really interesting. And I've got a lot of people that I would like to look up and read more from. And the final book that I read for the Read-eh-thon was Soft in the Middle by Shelby Eileen. And this was a collection of poetry. She focuses a lot on her experiences with love. A lot of it is very melancholic, a lot of yearning, but there's also a little bit of discussion of love in other contexts, particularly a decent amount about self-love and the struggle with self-love. They also talk a fair amount about their asexuality in this, which I thought was really neat. I ended up giving this collection 4.5 stars. The next book that I finished, I started several months ago, and that is Moving Politics by Deborah Gould. This was a pretty incredible read. I am so glad that I finally got through it. I'm actually going to be posting a video that talks at length about this book, so it'll give you a really good overview and a little bit of discussion, especially how it pairs with the other book that I've read that's on my HIV and AIDS TBR so far. I originally put this on my TBR for the Tome Topple, and I definitely read it for that. I technically finished it during the History Challenge, and one of the days where the History Challenge and Tome Topple overlapped, so it counts for that as well. And this book also covers all of the prompts for the Heartathon. The Heartathon is focused on people who are heroes in education, art, and revolution. It fits education because they did a lot of educating and making people aware of the problem of AIDS. They also had some focuses on safe sex, as far as I know. And then, as far as art goes, art was also a big part of what some of the direct action groups did. Artists like Keith Haring paired up with ACT UP, but there was a whole lot of other artistic initiatives within this as well. And this definitely fits the prompt of hero in resistance because they were the most prominent direct action AIDS organization at the time. The next book that I finished, I completed all in one night, and that was Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This has been on my shelf for a while, but I finally got to this because this was the Krusty Club's pick for this month. This book focuses on Frances, who is somebody that's very studious, very school-oriented. She has some friends, but they aren't very close. But when she meets Aled, they become fast friends. A lot happens in this book. Some of it focuses on Frances's favorite fictional podcast, and another part of it also focuses on Carrie's, who is Aled's twin and Frances's childhood friend. One of the great things about this book was the fact that this did not focus on a relationship. It is very clear from the beginning that Frances and Aled are not emotionally involved. There's a lot of queer rep in here. Frances is bisexual, I believe, and Aled is demisexual, and then other back characters talk about their sexualities as well. So that was really great. I found the characters really engaging. I thought that the plot was neat, even though I found some of it to be a bit predictable. I really did enjoy this book. However, there were some kind of issues with it. There were places where some little details contradicted each other, which I think was probably an error in drafting and editing that somebody else should have caught. There was also some really weird pacing stuff. A lot of the chapters go really quickly, which is fine and actually kind of expected since Alice Oseman does graphic novels as well, so I felt a similar sort of pacing. But there were one or two nights that just seemed to go on forever. Just thing after thing kept happening, and so that was a little bit weird to me. So I ended up giving this book 3 stars. The next book that I finished was The Death of Vivek Ogee by Akwaeke Emezi. And I read both Pet and Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi in June and gave both of them 5 stars. I knew that this was going to be incredible. And it absolutely did not disappoint. This was a 5-star read. I'm so glad that Jessie put this as the NB Book Club pick because it was actually on my radar. I hadn't heard a whole lot of other people really talking about it. So this gave me a chance to pre-order it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. As you might assume from the title, this whole book focuses around the death of the character Vivek Ogee. And throughout the book, you get different perspectives and different points of time that you're hearing from people during. So throughout the book, you're collecting these different details about Vivek and about the other people in his life. There are a lot of themes about family and immigration, as well as themes about sexuality and gender. I can't really say a whole lot about what really impacted me in this book, but the last quarter of this book gave me an incredible amount of emotions. But as with every other Akwaeke Emezi novel, I highly recommend this. The next books that I finished were volumes all in the same series. I read volumes 2 through 5 of Saga. I read volume 1 for the reading rush a while back, and it was really great. I was really impressed with how just good it was, like from the artwork to the world that they're in. Everything was just really great, and that is really consistent throughout the whole, like all of them. I have given all of the volumes that I've read so far 5 stars because they are just incredible. The world is incredible. The fact that they can pan to so many different characters and you still feel so much about all of them. Like, I don't think there's ever a time where they pan to somebody and it's like, oh, okay, seriously, I don't care about what they're doing right now. Which can sometimes happen with multi-perspective things. The whole premise of Saga is that there are a couple that are from warring planets. One of them used to be a prison guard and the other was a prisoner, but they went and ran away together and had a child. So this whole saga is being narrated by the child from the future. So you get to know kind of about the couple and the people that they're around, but you also focus on 2 of the people from the 2 different planets that are trying to kill them. And that's all that I'll say, just because I don't want to spoil anything, but all of them are really great. I think there was some point in 2 of the volumes where, like, towards the middle, I was like, oh, well, maybe this one's going to be, like, 4.5 stars, because it's starting to get kind of, like, a little bit of a lull, but then the end of the book just brought me right back. So I think that's really great in terms of, like, pacing, too, because it's not all 100% all of the time. It gives you time to really appreciate all of the great things that are happening. What are you doing? Stop licking me. The next book that I read was March, Book 2 by John Lewis, and I read this for the History Challenge. The March series looks at the Civil Rights Movement, and it specifically looks at the pieces that John Lewis was a part of. This is all framed around his life, and it looks at his involvement in the Civil Rights Movement. I did enjoy book 2. There are a lot of details in both of the volumes of March that I've read so far that aren't really touched on in public school classrooms, partly because they're pretty intense details, but also partly because, at the very least, where I am from in Tennessee, we kind of get a watered down, kind of whitewashed version of the Civil Rights Movement. We get Reagan's version of MLK, and that's pretty much it. This actually goes into some of the gritty details of what happened. A couple of big events that this focuses on are the Freedom Rides and the March on Washington. I think this series is really well done in general. The main critique of this that I have is that there were a couple of times where he would talk about other leaders who had different methods than he did, and a different understanding of what was going to achieve equality. And the way that he talked about them, I don't think was as nuanced as it probably should be. I do understand that this comes from a very particular perspective. It is a memoir, not like a total recollection of history. So it definitely does have that bias, but overall it was still a really good book. And then the final book that I finished in the month of August was The Tragedy of Heterosexuality by Jane Ward. I had actually started this a few months ago, set it down, but I came back to it and finished it this month. This was an arc that I got off of NetGalley. This also technically fits the history challenge because she does incorporate history throughout a lot of what she's talking about. Basically, what this book does is that it identifies a few key problems with culturally the way that heterosexuality is and the way that heterosexuals treat each other. She also offers up some solutions towards the end as well. The way that she goes about investigating this, she talks about her own lens and how she's looking at it, which is great. She's a white queer woman, and she definitely makes that extremely queer. She makes that extremely clear as she's writing. And one of the things that I really liked is that she pulled up a lot of things from women of color who have talked about being queer and also talked about like experiencing heterosexuals. So that was really nice. She also goes through and looks at the history of self-help educational materials that have been given to heterosexual people. So she starts out looking at the books. She starts in the 1800s, which was apparently in the beginning of the romantic self-help genre, at least to some degree. After she looks at those documents, she talks about her field experience doing ethnographies in a couple of the programs that they have where men will go and learn kind of how to pick women up. She goes to a couple of them with a couple of different mindsets, somewhat more predatory than others. And then in the last section, she talks about information that she got from other queer people. I can't remember if it was a survey or an interview, but regardless, it's qualitative data. So it's different things that they said about their experience and how they perceive heterosexuals. Overall, I thought this premise was really interesting, and I thought that some of the problems that she identified definitely need to be talked about. However, I had a couple of problems throughout. I think that the strongest part is probably where she's looking through the documents, and even parts of the ethnography I really enjoyed too, but I thought that she could have used the qualitative data from other queer people better. The way that she ends up organizing it is that you have a bunch of quotes at the very beginning and then she talks about it some, but I think that the quotes could have been incorporated in a more efficient way. I do understand wanting to keep all of the quotes and even almost needing it as someone who has done qualitative research and had to write up papers on it. However, that's where an appendix would have come in really well. So it would have been nice to see her like utilize the quotes better and then have kind of a reference to the back so that you can read more on it. I also kind of thought that the 3 different, or really 4 different sections that I mentioned kind of all seem sort of separate. When she talks about the original framework, I think that I can see that throughout most of it, but I thought that the information from the queer people seemed like very separate from everything else, and I think that it could have been integrated better. I think that that separation also made certain things feel more anecdotal when she was talking in that section and in the section after, because there were a few times where she would list a bunch of things that she personally had experienced, which I think are important to bring up. But I think that her point in bringing them up would have been stronger if she would have alluded to the things that she talked about previously. There were also a couple of things that she said along the way that I kind of disagreed with, but that's not necessarily going to impact my rating of the book, just because it all made sense. And as I was reading, I couldn't help but think about the fact that there were a couple of pieces that really would have enhanced this a lot better. Since she's coming at it from a queer perspective, I think that talking about compulsory heterosexuality would have definitely added to this. I was surprised that she didn't talk about it as much. Obviously, the research would have looked different, but I think that it would be interesting for someone to look at the perspective specifically of people who came out later in life or who have had to deal with a lot regarding compulsory heterosexuality. I also think that there was more room to talk about bisexual and other multisexual people's experience, especially when, like, if you're looking at the problem of heterosexuality, especially looking at heterosexual men, I think that it's important to also look at bisexual and pansexual women who have to interact with them. Also, maybe looking at the difference between bisexual men and heterosexual men and how they interact in different sex couples. That is a whole lot, though. Like, I understand that you can't shove all of that into one thing. However, I think that would have been something maybe important to talk about in a sort of limitations section, or at least acknowledge a little bit more. But I ended up giving this 3 stars. Really, I think 3.25 would probably be a little bit more accurate. Next, we can move on to the books that I started this month but did not finish. I will be carrying these on to the next month. I didn't talk about any of these on my TBR, but rest assured I will probably read at least part of some of these in the month of September. The first one that I have is The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Cassara. I am really loving this book. I am over halfway done with it. I think I've got between a third and a fourth of the book left. This is set during the 80s, primarily on the drag scene. We go back and forth to a few different perspectives, looking at these people's lives and basically what they go through. The folks that we're focused on are people who are creating a new house, the House of Extravaganza. So this is a historical fiction. Some of the characters that are mentioned in this book I think were real people, but this is a totally fictional account of all of that. I think that Joseph Cassara does really well with the kind of multiple perspective thing going on, and the emotions that this book elicits. There is so much that these people have to deal with, and they are really harsh, really intense realities. The way that a lot of their personalities are and how they end up coping is that there ends up being a lot of humor. So I think that balances a whole lot really well without being so lighthearted that it just totally brushes over the problems that they're encountering. I originally put this on my TBR for the Heartathon, specifically because the art of drag would have worked really well for Heroes in Art, but I also think that some characters in this also really exemplify heroes in resistance as well. And then I also ended up reading a fair amount of this for the History Challenge. And since this was a historical fiction, it worked for that as well. The next book that I started was Tinderbox, The Untold Story of the Upstairs Lounge, Fire and the Rise of Gay Liberation by Robert Fieleser. This I also started for the History Challenge. This focuses on the New Orleans Upstairs Lounge fire, which was an arson that was the most deadly anti-gay hate crime in the United States until the Pulse shooting. I only got to page 30, however, there is an additional 19 pages that was a part of the preface and introduction that weren't a part of that page count, I don't think. Overall, this is turning out to be a really interesting read. I had a lot of emotions about the book itself, which you can hear about if you watch my TBR. But overall, Robert Fieleser's writing style is really interesting. It was kind of a stark contrast. I started reading this right after I finished Moving Politics, which is very academic, whereas Tinderbox is written by a journalist, so there's definitely a very different feel to each of them. I do feel like there are times when he adds on details that you don't really need to know, and like I kind of understand why, especially like, you know, you want to give as much context as possible, but I do think that there could have been a little bit of trimming. But regardless of all of that, I am ecstatic that this book exists, and I'm really excited to be able to finish the rest of it. The final book that I started during the month of September was Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton. I had this on my TBR originally for the Heartathon because Huey P. Newton is definitely a hero in resistance, and this was also a part of the History Challenge. Really, in the month of August, I probably only read about 20 pages of this, and then I continued reading through the 1st of September. But it is a really interesting read so far. There is a small, introduction that Penguin gives, but then there is the introduction written by Huey P. Newton's wife that really situates a lot of this really well. From there, it goes into kind of a manifesto about revolutionary suicide and what that is. Spoiler, this does not actually talk about people literally killing themselves in our typical understanding of suicide, but rather someone who is willing to fight for their rights even when they're putting themselves in harm's way. After that manifesto, it goes into his actual memoir. So this is Huey P. Newton's autobiography, and then getting into his actual life, he recounts his childhood. He even goes into, before that, a little bit about his lineage and where his parents come from, which I think is really helpful, especially the fact that we're looking at his politics and we're understanding his positions. I think that the history of everything is extremely relevant. And when he's describing his childhood and some of the decisions that he made, some things that are not things that you would probably want to talk about if you're wanting to put yourself in the most positive light possible, he still talks about, and he talks about why he made those decisions and how his position within society influenced that. And, you know, I'm only on page 40, but I am already thoroughly impressed. I think that there's like a little bit of sexism in here, but I'm not totally surprised just because of the time period. But I am really looking forward to being able to finish this. So that is all that I read during the month of August. If you've read any of these, definitely let me know what you thought about them down in the comments. If you haven't read any of these, let me know what your favorite book of August was. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye. What did you read, Tonks? What did you read?